The year was 1887, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing. For 14-year-old Arthur McBride, it was the only constant companion he had left. It had settled into the log cabin the day his father's coughing had finally stopped, and it had deepened into something permanent when his mother followed a winter later, claimed by a grief that had hollowed her out from the inside. Now, the silence was his inheritance, as tangible as the deed to the 160 acres of unforgiving land that surrounded him on all sides. His life had shrunk to the size of his chores, splitting wood, checking his snares, tending the meager garden, and staring out at a horizon that promised nothing but more of itself. Arthur was small for his age, wiry and tough, in the way of things that have learned to bend rather than break. His face was a perpetual study in solemnity, his blue eyes holding a watchfulness that belonged to a much older man. He rarely spoke, having no one to speak to, and the sound of his own voice often startled him when he muttered to the stubborn mule or cursed a rusted hinge. The world had taught him that survival was a quiet, solitary business. Emotions were a luxury, a weight you could not afford to carry when your every ounce of strength was needed just to see the next sunrise. His grief for his parents was a stone he carried in his gut, cold and heavy, a thing he never acknowledged, but was never without. He lived in a state of managed desperation, his routines a bulwark against the vast, crushing loneliness of his existence. He cooked his meager meals, patched his worn clothes, and read the same 3 books his mother had cherished: a Bible, a collection of poems, and a worn primer until the words were more familiar than his own reflection. The homestead was an island in a sea of grass, the nearest town, Harmony Creek, a 2-day ride away, and he had no reason to go there. The townsfolk knew his story. They saw him as an unfortunate footnote, the orphan boy clinging to a lost cause. Their pity felt sharper than their scorn, so he stayed away, embracing the isolation that had been thrust upon him. He was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life, a boy frozen in the amber of his loss. One evening, as the sky was bruising into the deep purples and oranges of twilight, a storm rolled in from the west. It came without warning, a dark wall of cloud that swallowed the mountains and galloped across the plains. The wind rose to a howl, a raw and mournful sound that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the cabin. Arthur had just finished securing the mule in its lean-to and was battling his way back to the door when he saw Ita's shape crumpled near the creek bed, almost lost in the whipping grass and gathering gloom. Caution was an instinct drilled into him by his father. Out here, the unexpected was rarely a friend. It could be a predator, or worse, a man with bad intentions. He flattened himself behind a rocky outcrop, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and squinted through the rain-lashed air. It was not an animal. It was a person, small and still. He watched for a long moment, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, his mind racing through a dozen grim possibilities. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and he saw the dark braids, the buckskin dress, the unmistakable profile. It was a native woman. Every fearful story he had ever heard in Harmony Creek came rushing back, tales of raids, of bitter land disputes, of a people who had every reason to despise settlers like him. His father had been different. He had spoken of the Cheyenne with respect, trading with them fairly, and counseling a peace that few others seemed to want. But his father was gone. To help her was to invite a world of trouble he was not equipped to handle. To leave her was to let the storm and whatever had brought her down finish the job. He saw her stir, a faint, weak movement, a hand clutching at her side. He could see the dark stains spreading on her dress even from this distance. The stone of grief in his gut seemed to shift. He thought of his mother, her body growing colder in her bed while he had watched, helpless. He had been a boy then, powerless. He was still a boy now. But this was different. This was a choice. The wind howled like a thing grieving, and in its cry, Arthur made his decision. He pushed himself to his feet and ran, not toward the safety of his cabin, but toward the fallen stranger. She was younger than he first thought, perhaps only a few years older than himself. Her face, beautiful and angular, was pale beneath its copper tone, her lips tinged with blue. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken, and a deep, ragged gash in her side was bleeding sluggishly. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her, dark and filled with a mixture of pain and fierce, defiant mistrust. She flinched as he reached for her, a low sound of warning in her throat. "I mean you no harm," Arthur said, his voice rusty and rough. The words felt foreign on his tongue. "You will die out here." He did not know if she understood his words, but she must have understood the desperation in his tone. He was clumsy and awkward, but surprisingly strong from his years of labor. He looped her arm over his shoulders, his own small frame straining under her weight, and half-dragged, half-carried her through the driving rain toward the flickering lamplight of his cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside, two solitary souls from warring worlds, bound together by a storm and the simple, brutal fact of a wound. Inside, the warmth of the small hearth was a stark contrast to the fury outside. He gently lowered her onto the cot that had once been his mother's, his hands shaking slightly. Her gaze followed his every move, sharp and assessing, even through the haze of her pain. He saw her eyes flick to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, to the axe by the woodpile, to the lock on the door. He understood. He was a potential captor, an enemy. He turned his back on her, a deliberate act of trust he could not afford, but offered anyway. He stoked the fire, his movements slow and predictable. He filled a basin with water from the rain barrel and brought it to her, along with clean strips of cloth torn from one of his mother's old linen sheets. He knelt beside the cot, placed the basin on the floor, and looked at her, a silent question. For a long moment, she just stared, her breathing shallow. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, she gave her assent. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he worked. He knew little of doctoring beyond what he had learned tending to farm animals, but he knew a clean wound had a better chance than a dirty one. He carefully cut away the blood-soaked buckskin around her side, revealing a vicious tear in her flesh, likely from the horn of a spooked buffalo or an elk. He cleaned it as best he could, his brow furrowed in concentration. She bore the pain with a stoicism that shamed him, her only sign of agony, a tightening of her jaw and the clenching of her fists in the thin blanket. He could do nothing for her broken leg but bind it with splints made from floorboards, his work clumsy but earnest. When he was done, he covered her with his thickest wool blanket and retreated to a stool by the fire, leaving her to the privacy of her pain. For hours, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the relentless drumming of rain on the roof, and her soft, pained breathing. He did not sleep. He watched over her, a self-appointed guardian in the heart of the storm. He saw the tension slowly leave her body as exhaustion overtook her. He saw the hard line of her mouth soften slightly in her fitful sleep. He did not know her name or her story, but in the small, lamplit space of the cabin, she was no longer an abstract threat or a political symbol. She was just a person, hurt and vulnerable, and he was the only thing standing between her and death. A strange sense of purpose began to fill the hollow spaces inside him, a feeling so foreign he barely recognized it. It felt like warmth. It was well after midnight when a new sound joined the chorus of the storm. It began as a low, mournful cry, far off, but it was answered by another, and then another, closer this time. Arthur's blood ran cold. He knew that sound better than his own name, wolves. The storm must have driven them down from the high country, and the scent of blood from the woman's wound was a dinner bell ringing across the prairie. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Vivina, stirred on the cot, her eyes wide with a fresh terror that eclipsed her pain. She whispered a single word in her own tongue, a word that needed no translation. Arthur moved quickly, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. He checked the bar on the door, ramming it home. He shoved the heavy trestle table against it for good measure. He looked at the single window, its shutterboards old and weathered. It was the weak point. The howling grew louder, circling the cabin. It was not the sound of one or two animals, but a pack. They were hungry and bold. He could hear the scratch of their claws on the log walls, the snuffling and whining as they tested the foundation for any gap, any weakness. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still glowing faintly. It was not much of a weapon, but it was all he had that he could wield in the confines of the cabin. The rifle was too slow to reload, useless against multiple fast-moving targets. A sudden, violent crash came from the window. A heavy body slammed against the shutter, making the wood groan in protest. Then a snout, black and wet, forced its way through a crack, teeth snapping at the air. Arthur lunged, shoving the poker into the gap. The wolf yelped in pain and fury, retreating with the smell of scorched fur. But the assault had just begun. Another wolf threw itself at the door, its weight making the thick wood shudder. They were relentless, a shadowy tide of hunger and instinct. Arthur moved like a cornered animal himself, darting from the door to the window, his mind racing. He needed to reinforce the shutter. The woodpile was his only source of material. Taking a deep breath, he unbarred the door, intending to be out and back in seconds. It was a foolish, desperate move. The moment the door cracked open, a grey shadow launched itself from the darkness. Arthur had no time to think, only to react. He threw his left arm up to shield his throat, and searing, white-hot pain exploded from his forearm as teeth sank deep into the muscle. He cried out, a sound of shock and agony, and kicked out with all his might, connecting with the wolf's ribs. The animal released him, and he scrambled back inside, slamming the door and ramming the bar home, his arms screaming in protest. He leaned against the door, panting, the warm stickiness of his own blood running down his arm and dripping onto the floorboards. That was the first bite. Vivina pushed herself up on one elbow, her eyes fixed on him, her expression a mixture of horror and awe. Through the pain, Arthur felt a grim resolve harden within him. They would not get in. They would not get to her. The wolves grew more frantic, emboldened by the scent of his blood. They began to tear at the chinking between the logs near the base of the cabin. Arthur grabbed a kettle of boiling water from the hearth and poured it through the gaps, rewarded by a cacophony of pained yelps. It was a temporary reprieve. As he was distracted, a wolf managed to claw a board loose from the bottom of the door. A paw, then a head, began to push its way through. Arthur stomped on it with his boot, but the wolf snapped, its teeth catching the thick leather and tearing through to the flesh of his calf. He yelled again, kicking free. The second bite. He grabbed a log from the woodpile and hammered the board back into place, his leg throbbing. As he worked, a splinter from the splintered wood drove deep into the palm of his other hand, a third wound in the chaos of the fight. The night became a blur of pain, fear, and desperate invention. He wedged his father's old tool chest against the window shutter. He used his dwindling supply of nails to hammer loose boards back into place. The pack was intelligent, coordinated. They tested every inch of the cabin, their shadows flitting past the gaps, their panting breath an ever-present threat. He felt a strange detachment settling over him, his fear replaced by a cold, animalistic focus. He was no longer Arthur McBride, the lonely orphan. He was a protector, a fortress of flesh and bone, and he would not crumble. Hours crawled by. The storm began to recede, but the siege did not. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on his shoulders, and the pain from his wounds was a constant, grinding fire. He had to stay on his feet, had to keep moving. He made a desperate sortie to the lean-to for the axe, a mad dash into the darkness. A wolf sprang from the shadows, clamping onto his thigh. The fourth bite. He swung the heavy axe in a wild arc, and the wolf fell back, but not before its teeth had ripped a deep furrow in his leg. He staggered back into the cabin, bleeding now from 4 separate wounds, his clothes torn and soaked in a mixture of rain and blood. He could feel his strength failing. His movements grew sluggish, his vision periodically tunneling to a pinpoint. The alpha of the pack, a huge, dark beast larger than the others, seemed to sense his weakening state. With a terrifying surge of power, it launched its full weight against the damaged window. The tool chest slid, the shutter splintered, and the wolf, a nightmare of fur and teeth, tumbled into the cabin. Time seemed to slow down. Vivina screamed, a raw, terrified sound. The wolf ignored Arthur at first, its yellow eyes locked on the helpless woman on the cot. That was its mistake. A primal rage, born of protectiveness and desperation, surged through Arthur, overriding his pain and exhaustion. With a roar of his own, he threw himself at the great wolf, swinging the axe. The beast turned on him, a blur of motion. It was faster, stronger. It dodged his clumsy swing and lunged, its jaws closing on his shoulder, shaking him like a rag doll. The pain was blinding, a universe of agony. The fifth bite. He felt the bone grind, but he did not let go of the axe. He brought his knee up hard into the wolf's belly, and, as it recoiled, he swung again. This time the axe bit deep into the animal's flank. The wolf howled, a sound of pure fury, and spun, snapping at him again. Its teeth grazed his side, tearing through his shirt and skin. The sixth bite. They were a maelstrom of violence in the tiny cabin, knocking over the stool, scattering embers from the hearth. Arthur was running on nothing but will. He felt his legs wanting to buckle. He knew he was fading. He had to end it. He managed to get his feet under him, planting himself between the wolf and Vivina. The alpha gathered itself for a final, killing lunge. Arthur held the axe ready, his knuckles white. As the wolf sprang, he swung not at its head, but at its front legs, a woodsman's trick for felling a tree. The axe connected with a sickening crunch of bone. The wolf collapsed, its front legs broken, but its momentum carried it forward. In its final, agonizing spasm, it lunged one last time, its jaws finding his already wounded thigh and clamping down with all its remaining strength. The seventh bite. A scream was ripped from Arthur's throat, raw and broken. The pain was absolute, a white light that consumed everything. The wolf fell limp, its lifeblood pooling on the floorboards beside his own. The cabin fell silent, save for his own ragged gasps. He stood swaying for a moment, the heavy axe slipping from his numb fingers. He looked at Vivina, saw her wide, tear-filled eyes, and then the world tilted on its axis and dissolved into a welcoming darkness. He collapsed to the floor, a broken dam of a boy who had held back the flood and been washed away in the process. The first light of dawn was a pale, watery thing, filtering through the grime and shattered wood of the window. It illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The body of the great wolf lay cooling on the floor. The cabin was in shambles, its sparse furniture overturned, the floorboards slick with blood. On the cot, Vivina was alive, weak but conscious. On the floor, barely breathing, lay Arthur. He was a ruin of a boy, his clothes shredded, his body a canvas of savage wounds. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but his skin was a ghastly white, his breath a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. Vivina had spent the last hours drifting in and out of consciousness, her own pain a distant drumbeat compared to the symphony of violence she had witnessed. She had watched the small, quiet boy transform into a creature of impossible ferocity. She had seen him take wound after wound, refusing to fall, his body a living shield between her and the pack. Now, in the quiet aftermath, a profound, aching gratitude filled her, so powerful it was almost a physical pain. She tried to move, to crawl to him, but her broken leg and her own weakness kept her pinned to the cot. All she could do was watch him, her tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, and pray to the spirits of her people that he would not die. It was then that she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that it was her people, fear for what they would see, what they would think. A party of Cheyenne warriors, led by her father, the war chief Vokin, crested the small rise overlooking the cabin. They had been tracking her since she had failed to return from her solo journey the day before, their search growing more frantic as the storm had hit. They saw the cabin, an alien structure on their ancestral lands, and their faces hardened. They saw the signs of the wolf pack, the tracks, the blood in the mud, and their expressions grew grim. They dismounted, moving with the silent, fluid grace of men born to this land. Vokin held up a hand, and his warriors fanned out, their weapons ready. They approached the cabin as if it were a hostile fortification. The door was ajar. Vokin pushed it open and stepped inside, his eyes taking in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance. He saw his daughter, alive, relief warred with fury on his stoic face. Then he saw the dead alpha wolf, its size and power evident even in death. He saw the state of the cabin, the clear evidence of a desperate, prolonged battle. And finally, his gaze fell upon the small, still form of the white boy on the floor. His eyes narrowed. The most obvious conclusion was also the ugliest, that the boy had harmed his daughter and the wolves had been drawn by the conflict. But Vavina cried out, her voice weak but clear. "Father," she said in the Cheyenne tongue, "no, he saved me." Vokin's head snapped toward her. His warriors, crowded in the doorway behind him, murmured in confusion. The tribe's oldest tracker, a man named Honyahaka, stepped past his chief and knelt, not by the boy, but by the scene itself. His wise old eyes read the story written in blood and chaos. He pointed to the bite marks on Arthur's arms, his legs, his shoulder. He pointed to the way the boy's body lay protectively between the cot and the dead wolf. He pointed to the bloody axe near Arthur's hand. He spoke in a low, reverent voice. "The boy did not fight the wolves to save himself," Honyahaka declared, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "He fought them to save her. He is bitten not once but many times. He stood his ground all night. This child has the heart of a badger who will fight a mountain lion to protect its den." Vokin looked from the tracker to his daughter and then back to the boy. He walked over and knelt, his knees cracking. With a gentleness that belied his fearsome reputation, he brushed the blood-matted hair from Arthur's forehead. He saw the youth of him, the pallor of near death on his face. He saw the 7 distinct, grievous wounds, each one a testament to an act of courage so profound it defied the divisions of their peoples. This was not an enemy. This was a warrior, in the truest sense of the word. A silence fell over the cabin, deeper and more meaningful than the lonely silence Arthur had lived in for so long. It was a silence of respect, of awe. Vokin looked at his daughter, and in her eyes he saw the truth of the tracker's words. He had come expecting to find his daughter lost, or to exact vengeance. Instead, he had found a miracle. He turned to his men and issued a series of quiet, firm commands. 2 of the warriors fashioned a stretcher from blankets and spear shafts for Vavina. Vokin himself gathered Arthur into his arms. The boy was shockingly light, a bundle of twigs and immense courage. He held him as carefully as he would his own son, his touch a silent apology for his initial suspicion, a solemn promise of a debt that must be paid. They carried them out of the battered cabin and into the clean morning light. The whole tribe, who had been waiting at a distance, saw their chief emerge carrying not his daughter, but a wounded white boy. A wave of confusion rippled through them, but it was quelled by Vokin's authoritative gaze. They placed Vavina on a travois, and her mother rushed to her side, weeping with relief. Vokin mounted his own horse, settling Arthur's limp body in front of him, cradling him against his chest. He was no longer Arthur McBride, the forgotten orphan of the plains. He was now a charge of the Cheyenne, a boy who had bled to defend one of their own, and who would now be protected by all of them. As the procession began the slow, careful journey back to their village, Arthur stirred, his eyelids fluttering. For a fleeting moment, his unfocused eyes met Vokin's. He saw no hatred, no anger. He saw only a deep, powerful gratitude and a respect that felt more like home than anything he had ever known. Then his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into the healing darkness, carried away from the silence of his past and toward the sound of a future he never could have imagined.